Do you ever wish you were more confident? Of course you do. I think we all, on some level or in some aspect of our life, wish we were a little bit more confident. The trouble is, most people have a hard time building their confidence because they don't understand the psychology behind confidence. Hi, my name is Nick Wignall. I'm a clinical psychologist and the founder of The Friendly Mind, a free weekly newsletter where I share practical, evidence-based advice for emotional health and well-being. And in today's video, I'm going to walk you through 4 of my favorite strategies, not only for becoming more confident, but very specifically for becoming more confident in the face of criticism. Number 1, remind yourself that confidence is a belief, not a feeling. A lot of people, I think, make this mistake where they assume that to be confident means to have a total absence of any kind of anxiety or insecurity or shame or anything like that. In reality, though, confidence by definition means that you are willing to do something meaningful and important despite the fact that you feel anxious or nervous or a little bit insecure. And this gets problematic in real life, I think, for people because this distinction between confidence as a belief versus confidence as a feeling, it matters. A lot of people go into difficult situations. They want to speak up during a meeting or broach a difficult conversation with their spouse or make a big life decision, even like leaving your job or deciding to get married, something like that. These situations where we really wish we had a lot of confidence, and they go into them and then they start to feel anxious, they feel insecure. Maybe they start getting criticized specifically as they're trying to do this thing. And then their anxiety really goes up. The mistake they make, though, is to assume that because they're feeling anxious and insecure, that implies or means that they're not confident, that they're lacking confidence. Unfortunately, then they start to feel more anxious. Oh my God, why am I not feeling confident? In addition to feeling anxious about this difficult thing I'm doing and getting criticized for it, I'm also now feeling anxious about not feeling as confident as I should. This makes the overall level of anxiety and nerves way higher than it needs to be. Of course, in reality, it's totally normal to feel anxious when you're doing something important or meaningful. And when you think about people either in your own life or people you admire from afar. It could be, the head of your company, for instance. You admire how they can get up on stage and just deliver a really motivating, inspiring speech, and they just exude charisma and confidence. Or think about your favorite athlete. We just had the Olympics. So think about all these like Olympic stars who, under the most intense pressure, they go and deliver, stunning performances. They're just the picture of confidence, right? Yes, it's true. People like that do have a lot of confidence. But what's not true is that they lack anxiety or that they lack insecurity or self-doubt or any of that kind of stuff. If you actually talk to those people, you talk to Olympians, you talk to CEOs and business leaders, you talk to politicians, they will tell you that, of course, they get nervous before they go on stage, before a big performance, before giving a big speech. Feeling anxious and nervous is totally normal. It's not incompatible with confidence. So the takeaway is don't interpret your anxiety as a lack of confidence. Number 2, acknowledge and validate your emotional response to criticism. Now, the great psychiatrist Carl Jung, you've probably heard of Carl Jung, he has this phrase, this saying, which goes, "What we resist persists." Actually, it's a little bit, that's kind of a reimagination of the phrase. What he actually wrote was, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." Doesn't quite roll off the tongue as well as the first version, but the gist of it is what we resist persists. Number 2, acknowledge and validate your emotional response to criticism. Carl Jung, the great psychiatrist from about 100 years ago, he wrote, "What we resist persists." And this idea is really important when it comes to confidence, especially confidence in the face of criticism. Because here's what typically happens. You've got to do this really difficult thing. Maybe let's say you got to do a public speaking engagement. You're giving a presentation in front of 20 or 30 people on your team. You're getting kind of nervous, you're feeling nervy, but you do it anyway. You give the presentation, but then someone in the crowd just really starts laying into you, kind of criticizing the way you approach the whole thing. And your anxiety just really starts shooting up through the roof. Now, our tendency in the face of difficult emotions like anxiety or embarrassment or shame, because they feel bad, we tend to assume that they are bad. And as a result, we either try to run away from them or try to get rid of them. often, unfortunately, by criticizing ourselves for having them. So we start thinking in our head, our self talk starts revving up, and we start saying things to ourselves like, God, why am I feeling so anxious? I shouldn't be feeling anxious. Like, I'm so weak. Like, why is this? Like, I should be confident, not anxious. The problem with that is when you either try to avoid or attack your anxiety or your difficult emotions through criticism, what you teach your brain is to feel anxious, to feel bad of any kind, is itself bad and is dangerous. This means you are going to, what psychologists call, compound that emotion. You're going to get anxiety about anxiety. You're going to get shame about feeling shame, which means your overall level of emotionality is going to be much, much higher and harder to deal with. But even more importantly, what's happening is because you're teaching your brain that you can't handle this difficult emotion because you're running away from it or trying to get rid of it, you're decreasing your confidence. Your brain is learning that they do not feel confident dealing with situations that provoke anxiety or shame, right? So long term, your confidence is going to go down. So this tendency to run away from or criticize our difficult feelings, while totally natural, is really unhelpful on a couple different levels. So what's the alternative? Well, you can do what's called validation. Validation is a very simple, straightforward thing. And it's all, what validation means is right there in the term, valid. To validate something, including an emotion, means to remind yourself, very briefly, that however uncomfortable, even painful an emotion is, it's valid. It makes sense that you're feeling this way. Even though you don't like it, even though you wish you weren't feeling that way, even though it's really uncomfortable, it makes sense. It's valid that I'm feeling this way. And here's the thing. When you do this, when you get in the habit of validating those difficult emotions like anxiety or shame or embarrassment when you're being criticized for something, two really important things happen. The first is you actually will feel a little bit less anxious in the moment. Validation, it's kind of like a pressure release valve on difficult emotions. It kind of buffs the harsh edges off of difficult emotions. Doesn't make them go away by any means, but it makes them a little bit easier to navigate and manage. So that's helpful just right in the moment. But much more important actually long term is what it teaches your brain. When you validate a difficult emotion, when you remind yourself that it's normal and okay to feel anxious, to feel embarrassed, especially when you're being criticized. I mean, who wouldn't, right? That's very, very normal. When you do that, you're actually approaching your difficult emotion, which teaches your brain, however uncomfortable, this thing is not a threat. It's not dangerous. So your confidence, your ability, your belief in yourself, in your ability to handle difficult emotions when you're being criticized, it goes up. So the next time you find yourself in a situation like this, you're going to be even more confident because you simply validated this difficult emotion instead of running away from it or trying to avoid it. Number 3, de-identify with the criticism. Now, occasionally in life, someone will criticize you and they will literally be criticizing you as a person, your character and worth as an individual. So I want to acknowledge that that does sometimes happen, but it's actually very rare. The vast majority of the time, when we're being criticized and struggling to stay confident in the face of criticism, what's going on is we unintentionally are interpreting the criticism as a criticism of us, of me as a person, when in reality, almost always, the person doing the criticizing, they're criticizing something much more specific. They're criticizing that proposal you just shared. They're criticizing a specific thing you said, a way of talking in a difficult conversation. And while all of that still hurts, right? No one likes getting criticized. Again, it's normal to feel a little bit anxious, hurt, embarrassed, ashamed when you're being criticized. What's critical to see here is that we often unintentionally make this leap and assume that we are being criticized as a person, when in reality what's getting criticized is a very specific aspect of us, a particular behavior, a particular thing we did or created. Now, that probably sounds intellectually relatively straightforward. You're like, okay, yeah, I guess I get that. But what matters is, what do you habitually do in the moment when that happens, when you're being criticized? And again, what a lot of us tend to do is we take things personally. You've all heard the advice, right? Try not to take things personally. And I think generally speaking, that's pretty good advice. It's natural to take things personally, to assume that someone is attacking you as a person when they're criticizing you. But Often when we get that advice, don't take things personally, that's all we get. You're like, okay, great. Like, sure, that sounds nice, but how do I actually do that? It's really hard when I'm getting criticized. So de-identifying yourself with the criticism, this is how you get better at not taking things personally. And what this looks like is, for example, let's say you are presenting a report or an analysis of something at work to your boss, and they criticize it. They really criticize it. What you might say to yourself is, okay, you know what? They were pretty rough on that analysis. It's pretty clear they did not think it was especially good. But that doesn't say anything about what they thought about me as a person. That's it. See what you're doing? You're splitting, you're differentiating the specific object of the criticism versus you as a person. You're reminding yourself that those are very, very different things, no matter how it feels in the moment. So I think practicing this, and I keep using this term practice because, again, intellectually, you probably understand everything I'm saying. You probably already know that. So you're thinking to yourself, well, I already know that. Like, why isn't this helping? I know that when someone criticizes me most of the time, they're not actually criticizing me. They're criticizing some specific thing, an action I took or a product I presented or delivered. It doesn't matter what you know. What matters is what you do consistently on a regular basis. Think about if you're trying to learn a musical instrument. Let's say my daughters are learning piano right now, so I'm get the great joy of listening to them be total beginners at piano. So what happens is let's say you're practicing you've got scales. You got to learn your scales. Within a specific scale, there are certain notes that fall within that and certain ones that don't. Well, you can learn that in 10 seconds, which notes are in a particular scale. But that's a totally different thing than being able to play skillfully within that key, getting the right notes and not the wrong notes. So knowing it intellectually, yeah, that helps. But to actually be able to play well, you have to practice over and over and over again. You have to build up muscle memory. So it's the same thing with not taking things personally in the face of criticism. Even though most of the time people aren't criticizing you as a person, you have to practice making that differentiation. You have to practice de-identifying with the criticism. And again, it's actually very simple. It's just a matter of remembering to do it consistently. So it's something like, clearly she didn't like my suggestion, but that doesn't mean she doesn't like me. Very simple, and even kind of intellectually obvious, but making the time to do it on a regular basis, that's what's going to lead to you getting better at doing this, at differentiating yourself from the criticism, and as a result, being more confident when you're being criticized. Number 4, thank them for their criticism. Now, this is obviously the strangest of the pieces of advice that I've given, but in some ways it's the most powerful, and I'll try to explain why. So remember, way back to the beginning, that confidence does not mean the absence of anxiety. Confidence is the belief that you can do something important despite feeling anxious or insecure or embarrassed or whatever it is. But the thing about beliefs, confidence included, is that they come primarily from our actions, from what we do consistently, not what we know intellectually. That's how our brain learns whether to be confident or not. It watches what we do on a regular basis and takes that as evidence. Now, most of the time, unfortunately, when we are in a difficult situation, we've mustered enough courage to actually do the thing, but then we're getting criticized on top of it, and our confidence just seems to melt away. Well, what's going on there? The problem is, understandably, when we get anxious, especially after being criticized for something we put a whole bunch of work and time and effort and energy into, we just feel really bad. Again, we feel anxious, we feel insecure, maybe we feel angry, we feel ashamed, all that kind of stuff. So we retreat. We just, our manager gives us a piece of pretty negative, difficult feedback, and we just kind of get quiet, right? And we sort of avoid it, right? Because we don't want anything to get any worse. Or maybe you get kind of passive aggressive about it. Maybe you kind of criticize back, or you start giving someone the silent treatment because they've criticized you. All of those, what's key to see is, what is your brain learning by those behaviors? When you avoid or kind of attack back at the criticism, in both cases, whether you're fighting or fleeing, your brain is learning that criticism and to be criticized and all those feelings that go along with it, they're dangerous, bad. And again, that not only makes you feel more anxious in the future, it lowers your confidence in your ability to handle those things well going forward. So, like we talked about in the strategy on validation, it's really powerful to, instead of avoiding or attacking your criticism or the people criticizing you, to approach them in a mature, sort of resilient fashion. And a really good way to practice doing that is to thank the person criticizing you. So, for example, let's say you're at work and you're in front of your team and you have put forth a proposal and someone has just really leaned into it and leveled all sorts of criticisms and critiques of it. And you're feeling kind of awful, frankly. You're feeling anxious, you're feeling embarrassed, all sorts of stuff. What you might actually do after you've kind of acknowledged how you're feeling, validated it, reminded yourself, right, that just because you're feeling anxious doesn't mean you don't have confidence. Maybe you de-identified a little bit with the criticism of the proposal, but it's not a criticism of you necessarily. After you've done a little bit of that, caught your breath, what you might do, either in the meeting or maybe even 10 or 15 minutes after the meeting or later that day, you might catch up with the person who leveled the criticism against you and say, well, David, I'm not going to lie, I'm feeling pretty rough. That was a pretty intense criticism of my proposal, but I appreciate that you were willing to be honest and really give me some good direct feedback. So thank you. Remember, the reason we're doing this is by thanking the person who's criticizing you. You're teaching your brain that you are confident. By acting confident in the face of criticism, your brain is learning that you are confident, and so you will then feel more confident the next time. The other really cool thing about this is what you're implicitly doing is you are reframing criticism, which usually feels like an attack, as feedback. And feedback it's a growth opportunity. So you're reframing the criticism away from this bad thing that I have to get rid of or avoid or not think about anymore. You're reframing it as this thing that, as much as it hurts, can ultimately help me in the long run. So that, I think, is a really powerful reframe and one of the big benefits of this idea of thanking the person for their criticism. Okay, let's recap what we've learned. 4 of my favorite strategies for not only remaining confident when you're being criticized, but actually for becoming more confident for future situations where you get criticized include these 4 things. Number 1, you want to remind yourself that confidence is a belief, not a feeling. The implication of this is just because you're feeling anxious or embarrassed or ashamed, that doesn't imply a lack of confidence. By definition, confidence means you believe that you can do something important and challenging despite your anxiety. Number 2, acknowledge and validate your emotional response to criticism. Tough as it is, you can briefly remind yourself, hey, it's okay to feel this way. I don't like it. It feels awful. I wish I didn't have to feel this way, but it's normal. It's valid. It makes sense that I would feel this way in the face of criticism. This does 2 things. It takes the edge off the anxiety, and it actually increases your confidence for future scenarios because you've approached your criticism and the difficult feelings around it rather than trying to avoid them. Number 3, de-identify with the criticism. Remind yourself that when people are criticizing you, however harshly, they're almost always criticizing a specific behavior or action or thing you've produced, not you as a person. But you have to get in the habit of reminding yourself that. It's not enough to know it intellectually. So try to differentiate criticism of you as a whole person, which is almost never the case, from them criticizing something specific. And lastly, number 4, thank them for their criticism. By deliberately approaching your criticizer with thanks, what you're doing is you're showing your brain, I'm not afraid of this thing, which is going to build up your confidence both in the moment and actually in future situations. And you're also reframing criticism not as an attack, but as feedback, which is a growth opportunity. All right, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I think you'll really like my weekly newsletter, The Friendly Mind, where I share my favorite tips, tools, and resources for overcoming the emotional obstacles to personal growth and success. You can sign up for free using the link in the description below. Cheers.